Known here as Rabbi Rick. Rabbi Rick holds degrees from Notre Dame, Temple University, and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. He has taught at Carleton College, St. Joe's, and at Temple University, where he is currently associate professor in the Intellectual Heritage Program. His primary research field is the Holocaust, with particular interest in how the story is told, via memoirs, novels, and films. He's the author or editor of 14 books, primarily on the Holocaust. He's a former executive director of the annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust in Churches and continues to serve on its executive board. He also serves as one of the softball team pitchers, and perhaps of greatest significance, he is the past president of the Adath Israel Men's Club. Furthermore, he has worked in our kitchen as an experienced grill man, cooking for our brunches, and is one of the 2 people who know the secrets to Dave's potatoes. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to serve them today. The title of today's talk is Telling the Story and Getting It Straight. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Rick Libowitz. Thank you, Rabbi.
And it was very early and very small and very non-aggressive. And the essential treatment then is nothing. You just watch. In December of this past year, PSA, the blood test showed higher, could watch for another year or do something. And I said, no, we're not going to watch anymore. And so in May, I had 20 sessions of radiation and a hormone treatment that knocks down your testosterone, because one of the unique things about prostate cancer is those cells eat testosterone like it was candy, and I'm fine. My test 3 months later, the PSA was less than 0.1. I mean, anything under 4 is good. So I'm telling you about this because I haven't made a secret about it, because for guys our age, and any guy at least 50 should get a blood test with the PSA. It's painless, unless you don't like needles. And just keep an eye on things. Found early, as in my case, very easily taken care of. Not taken care of, it's the second leading cause of death among European males. You have a 1 in 7 chance of getting it as we get older. So check it out, please. The other thing is that on Friday, I submitted my notice that I intend to retire from Temple at the end of the academic year. I still have teaching, but they have us teaching 4 courses a semester, and it's just too much to be able to do the research and the writing that I want to do. So I'm going to step down from that. Now, of course, that means I've got more time to get back in the men's club kitchen, or maybe do some adult education here, which certain people have been nagging at me for the last couple of years about. I won't mention any names, Marcy. So that's, I'm kind of looking forward to that. I know I'm looking forward to that. He went to a certain place in the forest, and he lit a fire in a certain way, and he said a certain prayer. And the danger was past, and the Jews survived. Generation later, our luck, our mazel, this is not very hot water. Our mazel, we were saved. 2 generations after that, trouble, and this time it was Shneur Liadi, Shneur Zalman, the rabbi of Liadi, the founder of the Musar movement. He went to the place in the forest. He didn't know how to light the fire. He didn't know the prayer. That was enough. And here we are. We don't know the prayer. We don't know how to light the fire. We don't even know the place in the forest. But we know to tell the story. And that's enough. Now, how do we tell the story? I ask my students sometimes to define the word history. And in a sense, history is everything that's ever happened. That's not what people mean when they say history or something's historic, but that lukewarm water is now part of history. We don't care about most things. The history we remember consists of those things we consider important. But history gets written by different people who consider different things to be important. So we get very different views, and we get very different cross-sections. Whether we're talking about the history of the Eagles, the history of women in sports, the history of politics in South Philadelphia, any kind of cross-section you want. And if you want to see the difference in different historians writing of history, read Richard Nixon's memoirs, and then read all the President's Men, and see how each one talks about Watergate. And you wouldn't believe they were talking about the same incident. In talking about the Holocaust, we get different types of writing. For a long time, it was only writing about the men, basically. And now we find out more about the women who were involved in the Holocaust. Victims, survivors, rescuers, and the like. In Texas, as some of you may know, a recent ruling in one town said that if you're teaching about the Holocaust in the public schools there, you have to teach the other side of it. I didn't know there was another side of it, but you have to teach the other side of it. The superintendent of that school system said that's ridiculous. Whoever passed that's an idiot. Oh, thank you. But we get this all the time. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit was 5 different depictions of the same event. Not written by historians necessarily. They're on film. You can watch them. And they're about Adolf Eichmann and his capture. Now, I'm going to be bold enough to presume everybody knows the name Adolf Eichmann in this group. On May 23rd, 1960, these are the cold facts. These are the undisputable things. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion announced the capture of Eichmann in Buenos Aires, Argentina, by Mossad agents. Eichmann had been living there under the name Ricardo Clement. He'd been working in a Mercedes-Benz plant polishing the chrome. And on the evening of May 11th, 1960, as he was walking from his bus stop to his home, he was seized by the operatives. He was held in a safe house. He was questioned. His identity was verified. And then he was smuggled out of Argentina on an El Al flight, disguised as an injured crew member. Now, those are the facts. I was a kid. I heard about that. When he was finally tried a year later, ABC television did a 15-minute spot at 11 o'clock every night, weeknights at least, updating the trial. People in the US, Jews and non-Jews alike, weren't too interested in the Holocaust at that point. In fact, American Jews were never too interested in the Holocaust, which sounds surprising now to this audience. But this started to stir attention. And very quickly, 2 shows were made for television. 2 incredibly bad, incredibly incorrect shows. The first one is very hard to find, and COVID really knocked me out trying to find it. I wasn't sick, but some of you may remember a program called the Armstrong Circle Theater, late 50s, early 60s. And they did a show first in October of 1960, just 4 months really after Eichmann's capture was announced, and before anybody knew any of the facts, called Eichmann, Engineer of Death. It was terrible. The one thing they did that seemed correct was ask an actor who was known as Frederick Rolf to play Eichmann. Frederick Rolf was a German Jew who had escaped in the late 30s, so he had the right accent, and he knew something about it. The play was written by Dale Wasserman. Wasserman's best remembered for writing Men of La Mancha. Rolf's Eichmann was a little man, physically that fit the part, who was constantly mistaken to be a Jew, which was also something that happened correctly, but that this made him an ardent anti-Semite, and that he invented everything that was done in the Holocaust. And frankly, that just isn't so. Family Museum in New York and its branch in Los Angeles have the only two prints. It used to be called the Museum of Television and Radio. And you could go there and watch it, but when COVID hit, I couldn't go there, and they won't send it out. So it took me 2 years till I persuaded them to sell me a print. They said, well, if you can get permission from the copyright holder. That wasn't hard, it just took a little time because you had to do everything by snail mail and sign releases and all that, and pay them a couple of $100, but I finally got it. In a sense, it wasn't worth watching, but in another sense, because it was the first. And to be honest, about 6 months after it first showed, in April of '61, they reran it, but they made a couple little tweaks in it that made it better. Well, that was the first one. And what it told you was there was this man named Eichmann who hated Jews and who was captured. And that's about all. The second one was done for ABC television. It was done also in 1961. It was called Operation Eichmann. And again, it had a German Jewish refugee playing the part, and another Austrian Jewish refugee playing the part of Rudolf Hess. Werner Klemperer, a year before he became Colonel Klink, played Eichmann, and John Banner, a year before he became Sergeant Schultz, was playing Hess. Ruta Lee was in it. A pretty good cast. Well, this one was more interesting. Klemperer had served was the son of the conductor, Otto Klemperer. He had served in the American Army during the war, and he'd already played Emil Hahn, a Nazi jurist, both on Broadway and then later on in the film Judgment at Nuremberg. So he had these parts down pretty well. So let me read. This is part of a monograph I'm writing that's part of a book on what was in popular media on the Holocaust from 1945 to '65. Klemperer's Eichmann is egomaniacal, imperious, and fully committed to the Third Reich. And if you ever saw Klemperer, you know he was quite bald, or as we say, follicle challenged. So the way they let the years pass, they had toupees on him that got gradually smaller and smaller. In the words of Eric Hoffman, he is a true believer, utterly devoted to removing the Jewish bacillus from Europe, a man who gives orders and does not tolerate disagreement or disobedience. In the first scene, a small group of officers have been summoned to a meeting at Eichmann's office in Berlin, where it is divulged in semi-coded language that a determination has been made as to the final solution of the Jewish question, en Losung. When questions are raised as to the 2-year timetable demanded for completion of the task, he states that the details have been worked out and insists it can and must be done. In subsequent scenes, it's Eichmann who determines that gassing Jews with the industrial fumigant, Zyklon B, would be effective and inexpensive, and it would speed up the process, sparing German soldiers the task of personally shooting each individual and saving ammunition for the front. We see construction of what is to be a gas chamber at Auschwitz as a worker asks why he is installing shower heads that will receive no water. Upon completion of construction, the first test group is brought by truck to the site. A character called David, a fictional character who's working on a cleanup crew, sees his parents in the line. The audience watches them enter the gas chamber and hears their screams. The drama then jumps a year to February 1943, following the surrender of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. Eichmann meets with Heinrich Himmler, who suggests that Germany could actually lose the war, and evidence of their genocidal activities must be destroyed. Eichmann proposes exhuming the bodies from the mass graves and burning them. Disposing of the remaining bone ash would be simple. Thereafter, all victims of the camps would be cremated. In yet another scene, Eichmann rages on the telephone over breakdowns of the crematory ovens. Ignoring the engineer's reminder that the ovens were designed to be used no more than 16 hours a day, he insists it's a national priority that they be run around the clock. There are several escapes from Auschwitz. Eichmann orders the public execution of a guard who had been bribed by the escapees. All of this is fiction. All of this is fiction. He also orders and observes the execution of one Jew from each barrack as punishment and deterrent. That happened, but Eichmann wasn't involved in it. With Allied armies approaching, Eichmann orders the removal of prisoners from Auschwitz. He did not give that order. And a dismantling of the ovens for transport by truck to other camps. They did not dismantle the ovens. When their route is blocked by retreating German troops, he shoots one soldier who tries to run away, orders machine guns to be used on the Jews in the trucks, and then leaves carrying a suitcase full of jewelry to begin his own fight for justice. Unknown to Eichmann, this character David survives, as do several other children who've been shielded by bodies in the truck. Eichmann returns to Berlin and his mistress, Anna, wearing the uniform of a common German soldier whose name and identification he has assumed. This is almost true. Eichmann was arrested. He identified himself as Otto Eichmann, a common German soldier, was held by the Americans until he escaped. He believes that with Hitler, Himmler, and Göring dead, he is now the logical successor to Nazi Party leadership, and orders arrangements to be made for his escape. 5 years later, he and Anna are living comfortably in Spain. She brings his wristwatch to a jeweler for repair. Upon opening the case, the watchmaker, a survivor, discovers a Hebrew inscription, a discovery he shares with the shop owner. They transmit their information to authorities in Israel. A team is assembled, and they go after him. Now, let me shorten this a little bit. Basically, the film follows every rumor that was made about Eichmann. There had been rumors that he was living in Spain. He never lived in Spain. There were rumors he lived in Kuwait. The movie shows him living in Kuwait and escaping when Mossad plants the story that Eichmann was actually Jewish. He does live in Austria for 5 years after the war, 1950, with the help of the Vatican and their pipeline. He gets to another new passport and gets to Argentina with his wife and 3 children, not with his mistress. Eichmann was a ladies' man, but he was also pretty devoted to his family. So his 3 sons come with him, and a 4th son, Ricardo, is born in Argentina. The script, it has so many errors. These are just a few. The opening meeting at which Eichmann describes the plans for the final solution is said as being in 1941. The Wannsee conference that decided that decision, which Eichmann attended, was in 1942. So they're a year off to start. In the film, Eichmann is driven to Auschwitz to observe the first gassing of prisoners. In fact, the first tests were performed on Russian soldiers, not on civilians. While Zyklon B is identified as the killing agent, they show it as a liquid. They used pellets that would melt at body temperature. So it was safe to handle until it was warmed up. Eichmann's position in the Nazi hierarchy is also somewhat magnified. He performed a key task in the final solution, but he never rose above the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was not part of the high command at all. Upon the war's conclusion, he lived under an assumed name in Austria. As I said, there's no evidence that Eichmann personally shot or killed anyone. The film's depiction of his killing a fleeing German soldier and a would-be assassin when the German leadership is kind of tired of his demands, totally made up. There's virtually no mention of Eichmann's family, only a telephone call from his wife, whom he calls by the wrong name in the opening scenes. And he tells her to stay in Munich rather than joining him in Berlin, where the mistress is. The 2 best books about this are these. The best one is The House on Garibaldi Street. It's written by Isser Harel, who was the head of the Mossad. The other is called Eichmann in My Hands by Peter Malkin. Peter was the one who actually grabbed Eichmann physically and threw him into the car. These are the 2 best. They differ in some of their attitudes and opinions, but factually, they're the best 2. Neither one both make reference to Eichmann's concern about his family's safety. Quite different from what we get in this movie. The funny thing, I'm going to skip a little of this, is the capture. Eichmann has killed an assassin that has been sent to kill him by the other Germans. And they claim that, okay, they understand him now. He's got to leave Argentina. He knows that the Jews are after him. And they're going to send him to Mexico, where he'll be the head of operations there for Central and North America. He's wily enough not to believe them. He goes to the airport. He changes his ticket. He wants to fly to Austria. But he doesn't have enough money to cover the difference in the price, so he's got to go home and get more money. Gets on the bus, and he's being followed by another assassin to kill him. And they're both being followed in a car by the Mossad agents. Eichmann realizes he's being followed. He gets off the bus. He starts running because this assassin's following him. The Mossad agents knock down the assassin and grab Eichmann in broad daylight. There was no such assassin. Eichmann was captured after dark. It's totally made up. And the opening and the closing of the film has Eichmann very defiant about what he's done and very proud about what he's done. In truth, in his interrogations, he always tried to minimize his role. Just a paper pusher, that's all. It's a terrible film. The best film, I think, is called Operation Eichmann. Excuse me, wrong one. Keep my papers together better. It's called The Man Who. It's called The House on Garibaldi Street. It's had a great cast: Martin Balsam, quite a few others, and Eichmann is played by Robert Duvall. Now you're laughing. Let's be fair. Duvall does a great job in concealing his Texas accent and coming up with a decent German accent, and he nails the part. It shows step by step, first the disbelief and the disinterest in Israel to capture Eichmann. They had bigger worries at that point, they felt, 15 years after the war. The process of getting information that came from a blind survivor in Argentina who alerted a justice minister in West Germany who personally brought the information to Israel. They finally check it out, and through photographs they feel it's Eichmann. They send the team, they rent safe houses, they keep renting different cars that they switch off so they can't be identified. They have lots of trouble with the cars because the cars were in lousy condition. And they finally make the capture. They bring him to a safe house. A doctor examines him. From the medical records they have, they identify him by scars, by dental work. The SS tattoo that would be under his left arm with his blood type had been scratched away. The fact that there's only that scar tissue tells them something. He finally admits who he is. Now they have to get him out of the country. They'd arranged that. El Al did not have any flights to Argentina or to South America at that point, but they wangled an invitation to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Argentina's independence. They brought a plane in, they smuggled him out, disguised him as a El Al operative who had partied a little too much in Buenos Aires, was in a little traffic accident, had suffered a head injury, bandage him up, dope him up, and they take him to Israel. So that's the best version. After that, The Man Who Captured Eichmann. That's based on Peter Malkin's book. Uses a British actor named Peter Arliss as Eichmann. And not quite as good. Casting was quite faithful to the physical descriptions of the book, except for one exception. Jeffrey Tambor, an actor I'm sure you've seen many times, played Isser Harel. Isser Harel was about this tall. Tambor's 6'1". So that And there used to be jokes about how short Harel was. They had to leave out those jokes. They have a lot of scenes in this film about Eichmann's sons looking for him in the hospitals, in the morgue, and being right on the heels of the Israelis as they race to the airport. That's not quite true, but it's not bad. I want to talk a little more about the most recent film, which some of you may have seen. It's called Operation Finale. It came out in 2018, and it starred Sir Ben Kingsley as Eichmann. It is the worst miscasting of the 5 films. First of all, Kingsley was too old for the part. He was already over 70. I can say that since I'm over 70. He was too old for the part. They did flashback scenes in which he was in the army during the war, when Eichmann would have been in his 30s. And to make him look like a 30-year-old, they put so much pancake makeup on him that he did not look human. He doesn't even try to have a British accent or have a German accent. He sounds like an Oxford Don. Reasonable speaking, etc., etc., etc. You start to feel sorry for him. You start to feel, oh, this is a nice guy who terribly miscast. The film was given at best a lukewarm response from the critics. Malkin is portrayed by Oscar Isaac, who's a kind of a George Clooney lookalike. And he has the task of channeling both detached experience in planning the capture and rage as he struggles not to kill the handcuffed monster who's in pajamas. And they put him in blue and white striped pajamas, the same as the concentration camp uniforms. During the capture in this film, Eichmann struggles, and his glasses are knocked off and they're left on the ground. Sure evidence of a struggle be found by his family looking for him in the morning. Never happened. Mossad was much too careful for that. Eichmann was grabbed. He struggled briefly. They had one hand over his mouth, the other grabbing him. Malkin threw him into the car. 2 people covered him with a blanket and sat on it till they got to the safe house. One woman was in the team. She had a couple of different roles. Basically, she did the cooking, although 2 of the films agree she was a terrible cook. And she was also cover. She would go out with one of the male agents, and it would seem like it just a couple who had rented this house. In this film, she's turned into the doctor who's actually examining him. Also in this film, they add to the role of a girl named Sylvia Herrmann, a character named Sylvia Herrmann, who had actually dated Dieter Eichmann. And they have her doing all sorts of things that were done by other people. One other item they add, they have local Jewish girls doing things for the Mossad group, and one of them steals some money and is changing it into dollars and is caught by the neo-Nazis or real Nazis who are looking for him and tortured, and they gives away where the safe house is, and it's on and on and on. One interesting thing, the final moments of the picture include photographs of the real Eichmann in the glass booth that was used in this trial. Now, what are we supposed to make about all this? We've got all these different stories. Werner Klemperer's character must be dismissed. He's too bombastic. His version of the story is pure fiction. And the final chase scene and capture was, classic Hollywood. The other extreme, Ben Kingsley's performance offers a man for whom some sympathy might be garnered. At least one witness who met Eichmann in Argentina claimed he was worn down from his years on the run. That he expected to be caught by the Israelis and he wanted to get it over with. Maybe the closest portrayal were that of Robert Duvall and Alfred Burke. Their Eichmanns looked both drawn and proud, nervous once captured and obedient to the captors. I would suggest the issue rests neither with the actors nor the directors, but the anticipation of what the current audience is willing to accept. In the early 60s, they wanted absolutes. Later on, raised more questions. We find out that Mossad is not perfect. Mistakes happen, accidents happen. There have been too many staged Nazis portrayed in American films and television programs by now, either to surprise or infuriate us. It's more than 75 years since Conrad Veidt played Major Strasser in Casablanca. Conrad Veidt was a Catholic anti-Nazi who had to flee Germany for his life. And of course, the role he's given, a Nazi. The evil radiated by Christoph Waltz as Colonel Hans Landa in Inglourious Bastards has to be dismissed as cartoon fantasy. That film is just, I mean, it's fun to watch, but it's just cartoon fiction. So how do we find the truth? How do we figure the truth? What do we want to hear? There's a story that you'll find in the Machzorim, some Machzorim, about the 93 maidens. It's fictional. Never happened. How do I know it never happened? My colleague and former writing partner, Zev Garber, out in California, did a major study, traced it, all the stories down. It's a story. It was invented. It sounds good that these 93 young women, Orthodox women, marched barefoot in the snow to the gas chambers singing Ani Maamin. There may have been people singing Ani Maamin, but this story of the 93 maidens, we like it. So it's told. And it develops roots as a result. Is that harmless? Well, I suppose it's not too bad. But if we really want to know the truth in all its ugliness, we have to sweep those aside. Most people don't want that. I've studied the Holocaust now for just about half a century. And I had the fortune to study under Franklin Littell, who was one of the first historians of the Holocaust and who, as a Methodist minister, was in West Germany for 10 years, from 1946 to 56, in charge of the denazification of the Protestant churches there. So if anybody knew things, it was Franklin. I had the great pleasure of working with Elie Wiesel on a number of events. With Yehuda Bauer, many of the other great historians of the first generation of the Holocaust. I'm part of the second generation and we're getting older. The third generation is going to go in a different direction from what we did. But still, there's so much information that remains hidden, so much misconceptions. And sometimes it hurts to tear away the misconceptions because they're comforting. And then we have the deniers, the people who are so sure it never happened, they don't want to admit it ever happened, or they're proud that it happened and just think that they did a sloppy job and they need to finish it. The search for truth goes on. We found a great deal of information when the Soviet Union fell and many of its records were opened up. When East Germany opened up the Stasi records that went back into the Nazi era, we found a great deal of material. So there's a lot there that's still being dug up and still being found out. The war's been over for 76 years. There aren't too many survivors today of the Nazis, of the liberators, and of the surviving victims. Their time is precious. We lost Mike Herskovitz this year, who was just a terrific guy. There are tapes, I don't recall the name of it, of the 4 members of this congregation who were survivors. And it's a wonderful program, and I know they still have it at the synagogue. There is some burnout. Young Jewish men and women are kind of tired of hearing about the Holocaust. They say, you know, there's more to being Jewish than the Holocaust in Israel. They're right. But the danger is you forget about it. Those who forget about history are doomed to repeat it. Eli used to say, everything that happens to the Jews eventually happens to other people. The Holocaust was not the first act of genocide, not even in the 20th century, nor was it the last. Eli used to say the next genocide will be universal. We don't want that. So the scholars go on with their work, and the teachers go on with their work, and we have places like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that has a certain slant, a certain bias, and bias is not a bad word. Bias just means the angle that they're looking at, which is primarily historical. Yad Vashem has its own angle, and it's a wonderful place. I guess wonderful is a tough word to use for this, but they do a wonderful job. I was last there 2 summers ago. We will never have all the answers, but we have to keep asking the questions. And just as we do with Pesach at the Seder, we don't want to say, well, it's as if I was in the camp. We have to keep reminding people and asking the questions. And sometimes, well, I started you with a story Eli told. I'll finish with one. Eli used to say, there was a man who lived in a Stiebel, a little village in Poland, had a question that had no answer. There was another man who lived in another village, and he had a question that had no answer. And neither individual knew about the other, which was too bad, because the second question was the answer to the first. If you understand that, then you start to understand the Holocaust. So any questions you have, I'll try and answer, and it's nice to be back in one's own shul again.
Yeah.
So, anybody? Marcy?
Whatever happened to Eichmann's family?
Nothing. Dieter Eichmann was pretty much a virulent anti-Semite. He has since passed away. Vera Eichmann was allowed by Israel to visit her husband a few days before his execution. Ricardo, the youngest, who was born long after the Holocaust, has gone on publicly to say, my father was a monster. And this was a terrible thing, and he's not at all defensive about his name. His name is, he goes by Clement, which was the birth name he was given, but he's very open. I believe he's the only one still alive of the 4 sons. He would be now 61, 62 years old.
He mentioned that the 3 different generations of storytellers of the Holocaust tell it differently.
Yeah.
And you briefly mentioned the 3rd generation, which is now. What is their angle?
Well, it depends a little bit on which one. I wrote a piece about the different stages in Holocaust education. The first generation had to write the story. There was nothing there. They had to put it together and give us the first depictions. And the courses that we taught at that time about Holocaust were very broad. Second generation of education in it started to specialize. Here's a course on the concentration camps. Here's a course on rescuers. Here's a course on Anne Frank. Third generation started to use the Holocaust, so it became a hook for something else. Something like
Did you say lose or use?
Use. Something like medical experiments in Auschwitz and modern medical practices. So it would be a hook to start a larger conversation. It wasn't necessarily related to the Holocaust. Now we're getting more of that. We're seeing people in other countries that haven't talked about the Holocaust before talking about it. I read a couple of years ago a wonderful, wonderful paper by a young woman writing her dissertation at the University of Texas in Dallas. She's a Brazilian Jew, and she's writing just about the first piece on the Jews who came to Brazil after the Holocaust. Remember, too, we paint the Nazis deservedly in dark colors. The U.S. were no heroes. They didn't want to let us in. The conference that took place at Evian in 1938 was a key year. Because first of all, you have the Nazis invading Austria, and a plebiscite where 99.75% of the voters said merge with Germany. The Evian Conference came in July. I'll get back to that in a minute. October, Czechoslovakia was taken over, and then November, Kristallnacht. At Evian, 23 countries came to discuss the refugee problem. Some of those countries sent representatives after being reassured by the United States Secretary of State that if they came, they would not have to do anything as a result of it. It was for show. The only country that increased its immigration policies, its numbers, was the Dominican Republic. They increased it by 500, which was about the equivalent of the US increasing by 10,000. When I was teaching at St. Joe's, I had a student asked to join the class, and the class was filled, and I really was not supposed to take extra people. And I said, and she had an interesting accent. I said, "Where are you from?" She said, "The Dominican Republic." I said, "You're in the class." She looked a little surprised. I said, "You'll understand later. I figured we owe you." There was a ceiling of 70,000 German immigrants a year to the United States. The US made sure that was never filled, let alone expanded, because what you had to do, if you were, stay there, you had to fill out the form, this side, and this side, and this side, and this side, don't lose count, this side, 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 and this side. So you had a stack of paper 6 feet tall. And if it was all filled out perfectly, and if you had no criminal record, and if you had a sponsor in the United States, you would get a visa number that would allow you to come to the United States in 3 years.
Oh.
If you lived that long. And that was the work of the State Department, of a number of senators, and the Immigration Department. In Canada, a member of the parliament said 1 is too many. Australia didn't want any Jews. Couldn't get other places, and only the Dominican Republic took more, and they formed the town of Sosua. And there's still a few Jews there. And then there are the real heroes. The people who forged visas and whatnot that sent Jews to places like Shanghai, that got them into Portugal or Spain. Francisco Franco, who was frankly a fascist, let in any Jew who could prove some sort of Sephardic descent, much to the rage of Hitler, who was his ally, who had sent the Luftwaffe to bomb the Lincoln Brigade during the Spanish Revolution just a few years before. Another guy, surprisingly, was Mussolini. Until Germany really took over control of Italy, he wasn't sending the Jews. And he met once with Hitler. Hitler was complaining. And Mussolini had the greatest alibi ever. He said, "You know what kind of people I've got working for me. They're so inefficient that, we'll get it cleared up. Don't worry, we'll get it." With no intention of ever getting it cleared up. And it wasn't really until Germany takes direct control that you begin to see the sending of Jews to the camps. Who would have figured? Mussolini, the hero. On the other hand, you've got our saint, right? Schindler, Saint Oscar. Womanizer, alcoholic, drunk, spy for the Abwehr before the war, saves 1,400 people. A lot of real sweet, nice people didn't do a damn thing. But we have to get the whole story better. Anybody else? Please.
Movies about historical events are generally sort of the characters and the events themselves are sort of condensed into single people, into single events.
Oh yeah, often.
Even the good ones, I mean, the ones that are generally regarded as pretty good, they're not truthful, right, in that respect. I mean, they're not but they're still useful, aren't they? They keep us from forgetting these events.
Anytime you see a movie that starts off based on true events, you know it's been fictionalized. There was a movie that was done in Germany, in West Germany, called The Nasty Girl. It was based on a book written by the Nasty Girl. Her name is Anna Rosmus. She lives in the US now. I've known Anna for about 25 years. As a young girl in West Germany, she raised some questions. She wanted to know what had been done in her small town during the war. And she raised questions that, this is in the 1960s, people did not want asked. And she took on a lot of flack and whatnot. Well, the movie's an interesting movie. So I asked her once she had signed the rights to it, how much input did she have on the story? She said, absolutely none. Once they wrote the check, they didn't want to see me. They wrote their own version. So this is what happens. And certainly, well, even in Schindler's List, Stein is 3 characters rolled into one, because otherwise the movie gets too complicated. Look, it's a starting point. It's like those broad histories that we read. You start with that, you get a base. When we teach kids American history, you teach a second grader or a third grader stuff that you're going to have to correct when they're in by the time they're in high school. That's just the way education works. They're not ready for some things. They have an interesting. How many of you have been to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C.? Well, you know, there are some exhibits that are in wells. So if you don't want to look in the well, or if you have children that can't see over it, you don't want them to see it, they're not ready to see it, fine. When they're ready, when they're old enough, then they look in. So, yeah, we get fictionalized, and sometimes it's crazy. One of the things I'm doing that's really I'm having problems with before COVID is tracing down what was mentioned about the Holocaust on radio. And I go from 1945, the end of the war, to 1965, when The Deputy played on Broadway. I don't know how many of you remember that play. I saw it on Broadway in '65. I'm finding stuff on radio shows that you never would have thought of. In an episode of Superman, with Bud Collyer as Superman, there's a reference to the concentration camps. On a Perry Mason, there's one about survivors. You find in odd places, but trying to find those scripts is one of the reasons I'm going to retire and try and find them. Anybody else? Please.
So you talked about the U.S. perspective during the Holocaust. What about FDR specifically? Like, so we were recently at the museum, and I'm trying to tease out like what is and what isn't.
And he was so wily a politician that he would have different people come in to meet with him, and they'd go away thinking he's right behind what they want to do, and then he'd go and do whatever he wanted. Jews were not popular in this country. You had the German-American Bund. You had Lindbergh calling against the U.S. getting involved in the war. He does not interfere with the efforts to keep Jews out. He is a social anti-Semite. So was Eleanor Roosevelt at first. I mean, that's the way she was raised. But when she finds out about things, she gets damn well involved and argues with him. Rabbi Stephen Wise was the guy who contacted Roosevelt the most, and he never gets anywhere. He leaves thinking Roosevelt is with him. Roosevelt's saying he'll do what he can. Roosevelt does nothing. It's the work of a wily, there was a more wily politician than Franklin Roosevelt. Nobody. But he was not particularly a friend of the Jews, even though he had 1 or 2 Jewish advisors and named at least 1 Jew to the Supreme Court. I mean, that was politics. How are we on time? Are you people getting spilkus and it's time to go? Or, I'm willing to stick around and eat dessert and answer any questions anybody has. Marsh?
So I have a question that there's not necessarily a solid answer, but we're talking about how the Holocaust is getting older. There's less relatives of survivors.
Yeah.
And what can our community or adults do, in your opinion, to story, remember it, and make sure that it's part of their lives.
This is the hard thing to say. They're not going to remember it in the same way, any more than we remember the deaths of thousands of Jews in the Crusades in the same way that they remembered it 800 years ago. Time, distance changes things. There was a nice Jewish boy who went to Catholic school, and when I finished at Notre Dame, I spent a year going to school in Israel. And both the Menahel, the director of the school, and one of the women who worked in the kitchens were Auschwitz survivors. Tattoos on their arm, numbers on their arm. You won't find that today. You won't find many people who, well, even the connection I made with Holocaust survivors 50 years ago was largely of middle-aged people. And the people my children met were old people. And now you hear about the second generation, or the grandchildren of survivors, or even the great-grandchildren of survivors. And obviously, there's not the immediacy of personal contact. How many of you ever were present when Ellie spoke? Ellie Wiesel. Any of you? Yeah, Ellie just exerted a force. He's gone. And we can watch recordings of him. We can read his work. We can hear other people like me talk about him, but it's not the same contact. And that's just the price of survival and time passing. So what can we do? We can keep the memory alive, say this happened and we shouldn't let it happen to other people. I knew a number of people, including my father, who believed in Israel existing. He had no interest in going to Israel, but in case something like this ever happened again, there'd be a place where the doors would be open. I had the honor of meeting Ben Gurion some 51 years ago. We spoke to a group of us who were going to school down at Stable Care, which is where he lived in retirement. And he talked about his father, who was the kind of Zionist who sent other people to Palestine, but stayed in Poland. He said, I can't remember it word for word, obviously, but we are the gates. We're the gates. And he's right. Israel's not the same as Israel was then. The Israel when I got there in 70 is not the same as the Israel in 1948. Israel changes, Jews change. But to go back to what I said at the beginning, we have to still tell the story. And we want to make the story as accurate as we can.
Yeah.
So, please.
You mentioned the school district, it was in Texas or something.
Yes.
So typically, I mean, school districts design curriculum, right? For the
Right.
most part, there's not like a national curriculum here. Do most schools, like in high school, when kids study world history, is it typical across the country that the Holocaust is studied?
No. There are, I think, 7 states, including Pennsylvania, where it's mandated. Might be more than 7 now. I'm a little rusty on that.
It's
12
12.
now? Okay, like I said, I'm a little rusty on that. I remember a fella at Mount Olivet College in Michigan who did a study of college Western Civ textbooks for that general course that a lot of schools have. A number of them didn't even mention it. They have a section on World War II, and they might have a paragraph or less. So not everybody mentions it. We don't mention a lot of things. We've got textbooks that still say the slaves were really happy working for their kind masters.
Oh, come on.
Oh yes, we do. Just as when I was a kid and we went down to Florida, Washington's birthday, before we had these Monday holidays, Washington's birthday was always on the calendar. Lincoln's birthday was not. Robert E. Lee's birthday was. We're still dealing with prejudice. Don't think we're not for a minute. And the new rise in anti-Semitism, and including a lot of young Jews who want to hold Israel up to a standard that even the prophets could not have maintained. have turned against Israel. It never seems to get easy, does it? The RickTrivane was the first design on Yid. It's tough to be a Jew. But I wouldn't be anything else. Although I did find that I'm 1/10 of 1% Scandinavian when I did 23andMe. So I may be changing my name to Sven, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. I'll be glad to step in touch with you.